the program?
I'm fine with that.
Right.
Yes.
I'll just switch off my phone just a minute.
All right. Good evening, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to welcome amongst us Dr. Ajit Bhide and Dr. Anjali Chhabria. I have known them for a very long time, and I'm proud to say that I consider them as amongst my dearest friends, though they both are quite a few years senior to me. But they have been the kindest of people I've known. Dr. Bhide, I'm sure Dr. Anjali will tell you about his professional achievements, but I've known him as a person who's really, truly multifaceted. He's an actor, he's an author, he is a satirist, he's an orator par excellence. He loves to read. I've had the opportunity and the pleasure of sharing and regaling many of his stories from the past and a couple of trips we've been together. And he's one of the people in the world of psychiatry, especially in India, who I really admire a lot. And I've managed to find an equal to him this evening to moderate the session. Dr. Anjali Chhabria, I've known her for a while, and she's a very, very dear friend. She is a professional par excellence. She is a founder of Mind Temple Clinic and Mind Temple Institute at Juhu. She has done her MBBS from JJ and subsequently her post-graduation in psychiatry from Nair Hospital in 1990. She has a diploma in psychotherapy. She founded the Mind Temple Clinic in 2005. It has become an institute of sort in the western suburbs of Mumbai. She has served on the board of Children's Film Society and is currently a director in the Salam Bombay Foundation. She is a regular columnist. She's a household name. She is a very popular media star from our neck of the woods in psychiatry. She has been a panelist on various media-related events, on TV shows, etc. She has conducted numerous workshops on mental health and emotional well-being for various schools, colleges, and institutions, as well as a whole bunch of corporate houses. And she is involved in cutting-edge technologies and innovative treatment modalities such as RTMS and TCDS at her clinic with a few other people. She is a clinician par excellence. She has written a book. She's authored a book on Death is Not the Answer, which has, if she needed any more recognition, it has gotten her a lot more across the international community. And her vision is to simplify the complex nature of human mental health. So we are very grateful to her to have taken the time out from a busy schedule and agreed to chair and moderate this session. And I welcome her to take over the proceedings for the evening. And I'll step in back again at the end to just kind of sum it up and thank you all. Over to you, Dr. Anjali, please.
Thanks, Rashmin, for that lovely introduction. You were actually embarrassing me, but thank you so much for the same. We'll move on today first for the topic of the day, which is suicide prevention. You know, when we all meet, we say that suicide prevention is too large a job to be done only by psychiatrists. And we all, as psychiatrists, you know, the budding students that you are, we all know how easy it is to prevent suicide and how difficult it is. And if anyone asks us that, can you tell us who is going to commit suicide is first of all a wrong term. Who is going to die of suicide? I think the only time we have answers is in the first 3 months of our psychiatry term, where we think we know it all. As we go on in the field, we understand how complex it is. Even our last 2 years of COVID have shown us that, yes, in the beginning, we felt that, oh, no more suicides happening. And today we are talking about how the suicide rate has doubled in the last 2 years, from 10 to 20. So, of course, we are going to hear about it from Dr. Ajit Bhide. As Rashmin has already given you a brief introduction of him, let me tell you, he is really one of the admired psychiatrists of India, known nationally and internationally. And I remember meeting Dr. Bede. I'm a few years junior to him. And I said, okay, if I want to be a psychiatrist, I want to be like him. So, Dr. Bede, that's how much I was impressed when I met you the first time. You've always left a mark on whoever you have met. So I'm sure that that's the same thing that you're going to do. Now, let me just introduce him. Yes, he was the past president of the Indian Psychiatric Society in 2018 to 2019. He's been an alumnus of the St. Joseph's Boys High School, St. John's Medical College, and NIMHANS Bangalore. And ever since he was a student, yes, not only did he debate, he was taking part in all the possible competitions and winning them, the school captain. And writing, reading, poetry was his passion ever since. No wonder he was the cultural secretary and went on to working with St. Martha's Hospital in Bangalore, where he has been the emeritus consultant psychiatrist, and he's been there for 34 years. He also founded the Family Center. Is that right, Dr. Bede? Over there, let me just open this. And he has chaired a lot of committees, chaired the ethics committee when he was the past president of the Indian Psychiatric Society, the advocacy committee, boundary violation task force on LGBT mental health in the past, and also past literary editor of the IJP. He's been the former president and CME chair of IPS South Zone, former secretary, editor, president, IPS Karnataka, and he's organized several conferences of IPS IAPP Bangalore as organizing chair, organizing secretary, and scientific chair at local and national levels. So basically, yes, because of him, today I think IAPP Karnataka exists. He's won, no wonder he's won a lot of oration awards. You know, the eminent ones are the Psychiatry Karnataka IPS, and he's won more than 34 awards. So let's hear it from Dr. Ajit Bede on suicide prevention. Over to you, Dr. Bede.
Thank you so much, first Rashmin, and now my dear chair, Dr. Anjali Chhabria. Just over 2 months ago, when we had the World Suicide Prevention Day, I had the pleasure of introducing and chairing the invited oration that Dr. Anjali gave us. So it's a little bit of Paraspara Prashausanti, and here we go with today's presentation. Thank you, Rashmin, for inviting me for the second time to be part of these PG Psychiatry Knowledge Series. My last presentation was on child abuse, and I was quite excited about the kind of response that we got to that particular presentation. And I look forward to enthusiastic participation from our young budding psychiatrists today as well. Just a minute. I'm not the most tech savvy of people here.
While Dr. Bede is getting his slides, please keep your questions ready. We are going to bombard him with lots and lots of questions at the end of his presentation.
Right, here we go. Idea? Right. So our topic today is suicide prevention, and I will go through it in a slightly skewed way, because my primary interest has been with youth mental health. And my presentation may seem skewed towards prevention of suicide, mainly in young people, but really it applies to almost everybody of every age range. How do we understand suicidal behavior? Suicidal behavior can be thought of as a cry for help. Suicidal behavior is sometimes an act of vengeance. You're angry with somebody, you want to get at them, and one lesson you want to teach them is by trying to take your life. Suicide behavior
Sir,
is...
sorry to interrupt you. Your screen is not visible, sir.
I wonder why. What can I do?
Yes, sir. Your presentation.
Do you want to share it with the host while you start talking? They can figure out how to share it.
I have not sent it to them.
Okay. Do you want to send it to them just now? And you can start talking till then. Should we do that, Rashmin? Nilesh, should we do that?
Sure, whatever works, or maybe he can just try to read over
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Bede, you can stop sharing and then try to restart sharing it again.
While I'm busy with that, I don't know how much I can talk. So I was saying that suicidal behavior has a whole range of purposes. And sometimes we are very familiar with the fact that we use our... Is it visible now?
Yes.
Yes, now it is.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yes. It's fine now.
So sorry about this technical glitch. Entirely my incompetence and my brilliant tech savviness. Visible? Anjali,
It's
visible?
fine. It's
Yeah.
fine.
Yes,
It's
yes.
fine.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we were saying
Yeah.
suicidal behavior can be a cry for help, which is the commonest paradigm that we use. It's sometimes an act of vengeance. It's sometimes an act of frustration. I have nothing else to do. I have no way of getting out of here. I'm trapped. Sometimes, and this is what I was about to talk, I was alluding to when I said we are familiar with this term that we say it is an attention-seeking behavior. So sometimes suicidal behavior is indeed just to garner attention of people around, to say that this person is desperate, he needs help or she needs help, which is more commonly the case, not being sexist over here. And sometimes, very rarely, suicidal behavior is a sedate withdrawal from life altogether. We have notions like prayopavesha, which is when people have finished all their duties in life, they are entitled to give up their life in certain cultural traditions, particularly among the Jains, not so much among the Buddhists, but also among certain sects that go under the broad umbrella of Hinduism. So you've got your children, you've got them reasonably well settled, you've distributed your worldly assets, and then you decide that you're going to go away. And this kind of sedate withdrawal is usually by starvation. But suicidal behavior doesn't have to conform to any one of these alone. It can be an admixture of any one of these, with the possible exception of that sedate withdrawal that we talked about. Now, this is a poster that was created for the World Suicide Prevention Day. There is help, there is hope, and we expect that people will not ever succumb to this distressful behavior. And Anjali has written a book about this, about Death is Not the Answer, addressing mainly young people about how they ought to choose life over death. Though at that particular moment, depending on the kind of paradigm that the young person is using, he may be driven to believe that suicide is the only answer.
Dr. Bede, the slides are not moving. We are still stuck on the first slide.
Oh dear.
Yeah. Can anybody else, is anybody else seeing the same thing? Because I can only see the first slide.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay, fine.
Is it better now? Is it
No,
moved?
it's the first slide. No, it's the first slide. We are still on suicide prevention. So if you want to the slides and use them just reference, that's also fine, because
Is this moving
you can
now?
just go on.
Has it moved on?
No, it hasn't. Why don't we just continue and then we can share the slides later?
How? I don't know when it will start.
No, leave it. It's okay. I think you just talk and then we'll just share the slides with.
Is there
Rashmi
any
and
tech
set it
support
to work.
available? Can they guide me? Tech support?
Nilesh, can anybody help him as to how to move the slides?
Manish, can you help?
Yes, sir.
The slides don't seem to be moving, Manish. Is there anything you can do about that?
No, sir. First, open your presentation
Which is done.
and then share screen. There, you are the share screen. Share the screen. Select only screen and then share.
I'm not.
Okay,
I'm
now it
not-
moved. Now it moved. Now it moved.
Sir,
Sir, put on the slideshow mode, sir.
Huh.
SB consequences.
Yes, 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 yes.
So the consequences, of course, are well known. One is that people who attempt suicide quite often, and tragically, this is what they set out to do. In most instances, they die. But apart from this one consequence, there are emotional upheavals. Whether or not that death takes place, there are emotional upheavals in the people in this person's life who has attempted suicide. Whether the person survives or the person is gone, there is an admixture of emotions in the survivors, and there is an admixture of emotions in those who are around when the person survives, which affect this person's life. There is anger, there is shame, there is guilt, and there is generally a huge opprobrium among the people who survived the suicide, among the people who witnessed the suicide attempt, and they unleash these emotions on the poor survivor, making life sometimes very much more miserable. And I think we in the mental health profession have a lot to do with dealing with those particular emotions. When the tectonic plates move, we know that there can be earthquakes. And even after the earthquakes, the tectonic plates under the ground keep moving. So there are new balances being reached when you have the phenomenon of earthquake. Similarly, this suicidal behavior causes new balances to be occurring. Some of these balances spell for better mental health. That's an unfortunate but true fact. And very often, the balances that occur are even worse for the person who has survived a suicide attempt. Being a survivor of a suicide attempt is no joke for people who have had this phenomenon in their family. Now, you as undergraduates and as postgraduates would be facing this distinction between completed suicide and attempted suicide. And a whole lot of people, a whole lot of aspects are listed over there. For example, one common thing is that suicide attempt seems to be much more common among females, whereas completed suicide seems to be much more common among males. But is that really something which we should take scientifically very, very seriously? Because those who end up in the cohort of the attempted suicide are those who survive, and the chances of survival are greatly altered by factors such as what kind of help was, whether help was available in the first place, what kind of help was available, how quickly could the patient be taken to be rescued. And this is something which we have to ponder over. So this distinction, much as it may be a very popular examination question, is somewhat artificial and something we should not be too preoccupied about. Now, Emil Durkheim, the name suggests he's a German-Austrian, but he's actually a Frenchman, and sometimes considered the father of medical sociology. A great sociologist, he gave us this typology of suicide. One very important concept that he delivered to us was anomie. Anomie means having a society which is in a state of huge upheavals and lack of stability is the hallmark of this society. In our country, we've been having anomie going on for at least 80 or 90 years. And unfortunately, we don't seem to be settling down. How do we say that? The social disparity is so marked in this country, though movement from one segment of society to the other does occur, it's a very rare phenomenon. And we had somebody speaking recently about two Indias. That is a classical symptom of a country that is not at peace with itself, which has not found sufficient equilibrium. Altruistic suicide is when somebody gives up his life for a greater cause. Okay, and typically we think of people who are soldiers who go to the front, but that's not really true, because they don't go out with the idea of ending their life. On the other hand, some of you may have seen this old classic film based on R.K. Narayan's novel, where a particular guide, the movie's guide, and in that a tour guide who is who identifies himself with the population who have been starved of rain, decides to go on a fast unto death. And now that is truly something of an altruistic suicide. Those of you who have not seen the story would want to know what happens to the guy. He dies actually, and there is rain which comes. Now, the cause-effect relationship is not something I'd like to dwell on over here, but that is the classic case of an altruistic suicide. Then you have fatalistic suicide, when there is absolutely no way out. And this particularly pertains to people in dire poverty on the one hand, of great relevance even today in our country, and also people who have terminal illnesses, who feel that the only way out of burdening the family, of themselves being burdened by the notion of having something terrible happening to them, is to give up life, and that is fatalistic. Egoistic is when we have a great deal of pride, a great deal of self-importance, and this self-importance drives the person into believing that his life must have a complete fulfillment to his expectations, and when that does not happen, he decides to end his life. Now, altruistic, fatalistic, and egoistic suicides, all of them, it is worth remembering, are much more likely to be present when we have a society that has a great degree of instability. So economic situations contribute to suicide on their own, and it aggravates the occurrence of altruistic, fatalistic, and egoistic suicide. So to go back to what we had been talking about earlier, characteristics of suicide. First, it's perceived as a solution to problems that seem unsolvable by any other means. This is the only option left before me, is what the person attempting suicide seems to say. The person is perceiving himself or herself to be in a crisis, and the skills for problem solving seem to completely disintegrate in the face of this crisis thinking. But worth remembering that a large number of people, and this is what we in the mental health profession should capitalize on, they have a sort of ambivalent attitude that, hello, this might not be the only solution. This is something which I shouldn't be doing, but I'm doing it, or I'm thinking about. Suicidal solution almost always has an irrational component, and that's again something we in the field of suicide prevention capitalize on. Also, Professor Norman Kreitman, one of the leading professors from the University of Edinburgh, gave us this idea that suicide and suicidal behavior actually is a form of communication in certain families, that families get alert to other people's distress only when there is something suicidal in their talk, in their behavior, in their actions. Most people who are depressed, and depression is the commonest, well-known forerunner of suicide, do not commit suicide. But depression, the presence of clinically significant depression, especially major depression, increases the risk of suicide or suicide attempts. And this is something we should always be alert to. And when we have somebody who's attempted suicide, what we have to go on is to chase the symptoms of suicide, symptoms of depression, and see whether there is any diagnosable mood disorder that needs handling, because this is a fairly common occurrence. There are many myths about suicide. People who talk about suicide won't do it. Almost everyone who commits suicide actually gives a clue or warning, and that's why we say this is a myth. The second myth that is quite common: anyone who tries to commit suicide must be crazy. This is how the lay people speak. We in psychiatry would say they mean somebody who's out of touch with reality, in other words, psychotic. It isn't as simple as this. Suicidal thinking isn't necessarily a sign of severe mental illness. In young people particularly, depression is almost always behind suicidal thinking. Often, no one has realized that the person is depressed. If people really want to kill themselves, nothing will stop them, is another myth. What they usually want, the person who is attempting suicide, is they have some psychic pain, and they want this pain to be got rid of. The feeling of wanting to end it all doesn't last forever. Sometimes it doesn't last for long at all, particularly if things in the person's life change for the better. People who complete suicide don't seek help before their death. More than half the people who commit suicide actually have been to their doctor for help in the 6 months before their death, though they may not have told the doctor exactly what they're thinking about, especially not tell the doctor about their entertaining ideas of ending their life. So these are the myths we should be aware of because they are quite prevalent in the general public, and we as professionals have to be alert to addressing them and countering them. This is something which is quite common, and I had to even battle with a very bright postgraduate student of clinical psychology. Talking or asking about suicide may give someone the idea. This young man was doing a doctoral thesis on cognitive behavior therapy for people who are suicidal, and he was of the opinion, like many people are, that talking or asking about suicide may give someone the idea. In a fraction of cases, this might indeed be true, but usually the opposite is true. Discussing suicide openly helps people talk about their feelings and to look for other ways to stop the pain that is causing this fatalistic thinking to arise in this person's mind. Slides moving, Anjali? Dr. Anjali, slides are moving?
No, we are still stuck on slide 4. So I think you may just want to bring up the slides. But otherwise, I guess I'm sure people are with you. Just move up the slides to where you are.
Ajit, your slides are not moving at all.
Pata chala, sir. I don't know how to address this. I wish tech support would help me.
See, I go off the screen and upload the slides again.
Sir, Ajit sir.
Yes, sir.
Only click on the presentation and continue. Only press it on presentation.
Is this visible now?
Yeah, visible, sir, but
No,
not moving.
We are stuck at slide 4, SB consequences. We haven't moved from there.
Ajit, go back to what do you call that? You remove the slides from your don't download it or stop the upload and then re-upload.
End show?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, now we are moving. Now we are on slide 11.
We are on myths about suicide.
Okay,
Yeah.
I will leave it at that. I will not go to the slideshow, okay? And Anjali, please tell me if what I'm talking is not relating to the slide I'm showing, okay?
Ajit, if you can go on to full screen, probably it will start working.
Full screen kiya tha, to tabhi ye hua.
Yeah, no, you are not on full screen yet. You are, we are seeing on the sides the
other slides.
Yeah, go on to the full screen. Go right down. Go on to the full screen. Now we are back on slide 1.
Whenever I go to full screen, this is happening. So I'll just stick on.
Okay, I think you physically do it.
Yeah.
Do it physically. Okay, right now we are on some paradigms in suicidal behavior.
So, sorry, it's funny to be talking about suicide prevention and they put a question mark to ask whether suicide is preventable. What we have to know is that suicide is never going to be totally preventable. And I think this is something we have to humbly accept. But not to think of preventing suicide is criminal for somebody who is a mental health professional. There are some paradigms in suicidal behavior. We've all heard of learned helplessness as a paradigm in the etiology of depression. People who are in a situation where they have sought learned helplessness comes to us from animal experiments done by the great Martin Seligman, to whom we are also grateful for having focused on positive psychology and then from thence positive psychiatry. But more importantly, learned helplessness is something which is a person having sought solutions to his problems, comes to know that no solution is possible, or that is what he's led to think from his failed attempts. And then at that stage, he gives up the fight. And because of this, having given up the fight, later when solutions are actually available, his mind is close to the possibility of possible escape. And that shutting off of possibilities causes this person to then engage in suicidal behavior. Another very useful paradigm that I would like to focus on is the black patch on the fresco, on a fresco. So supposing you have a huge fresco with multiple colors on it, if you get too close to that fresco, you might be just in front of a very dark black patch. All you can see before you, and these frescoes come to us through life situations, through life in general, and you're focused entirely on something which is completely black. You don't see that there are a number of other appealing color schemes around you, and you think that everything is dark. There is no way out. So this is another paradigm. We've already spoken about the tectonic plates paradigm, and when there are upheavals in a family, then an earthquake is likely to occur. And metaphorically speaking, this earthquake takes the form of self-injurious behavior, quite commonly suicidal behavior. Also, there is this notion that milk, I mean, we know that milk can be made into yogurt or curd, but curd can never go back to making milk. And this is something which a patient's family fed back to me, that no, things can never be the same again. And many families, unfortunately, get stuck in this notion that no, what was a nice family has been ruined by this person's behavior. And this is something which we need to work against, actually fight against. So we have vulnerability factors, which we will be speaking about in a short while. And when those are aggravated by emotional distress, it might lead to suicidal ideation. If there is no ideation, there could be a retributive rage, impulsive behavior, but we don't have the time to go into all that. That is not our concern today. So when the suicidal ideation occurs, then the plans may arise. If there are no plans, again, it's not our concern, but from the plans we go on to whether those plans are executed or not executed. If they are executed, they might succeed or they might fail. But how do we know who is going to be at that particular risk? We will be looking at that in some detail in a little while. There is actually a spectrum of suicidal behavior. The full spectrum of suicide also includes persons whose behavior is clearly suicide related, but who have no intention of directly killing themselves. Such behavior has been referred to as suicidal gesture or instrumental suicidal behavior. Big terms, unnecessarily clouding the horizon, but I think the term that really conveys a lot for this entire spectrum is parasuicide. Those who engage in behavior that seems suicidal, but don't end up taking their lives as fate decrees. The person wished to use the appearance of intending to kill him or herself in order to obtain some other end. And again, Professor Norman Kreitman, whom we referred to earlier, who happens to be my guru's guru, but that's another story. These are the parasuicidal behavior. So we can think of suicidal gestures, we can think of self-injurious behavior. And for a long time, it was believed that all self-injurious behavior has a subconscious motivation of suicide. Today, we know that not all self-injurious behavior is suicidal. In fact, large studies looking at thousands of patients have shown that about 1/3 of patients who engage in self-injurious behavior have absolutely no suicidal idea whatsoever. I have, and I'm sure many of you have, encountered patients who say that by cutting myself, the pain that I experience is something which diverts my attention from the horrible life that I'm leading. So there are these cutters, and there are these people who will hurt themselves physically in order to reduce the psychic pain of other life situations. Some young people, unfortunately, young women, most commonly in the adolescent young adult age group, get actually addicted to this cutting behavior or other forms of self-injury. Suicidal behavior can also be thought of as manipulative. And in the context of relational problems, it is a reactive behavior, and it is quite commonly a dyadic behavior. It's one relationship that is going wrong, and the entire pathological behavior, which seems suicidal, is focused on that. If we look at the population, this broad circle that you see, unfortunately, my labeling may not be legible to you. You have a huge population. In that population, you have one cohort who may have suicidal ideas. In that smaller circle, circle number 2, as we go from the outside to the inside, those are the people who have entertained suicidal ideas. The third circle is people who will attempt suicide. And then you have the tiniest of the circles where suicidal behavior has, people who ended up with suicidal fatal outcomes as a result of the suicide attempt. This is one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is ask the general population about whether you entertain suicidal ideas at all. And this was done in the University of Cambridge as far back as 1946. And they found that about 80% of their postgraduate and doctoral students confessed that they had at some time thought that life is not worthwhile and they ought to end their life. But fortunately, not 80% had come anywhere near attempting suicide, only about less than, it's more than 2% who had actually entertained the idea of going about to the level of planning a suicidal act. So there is good hope over there. First of all, we'd like to emphasize that suicide is never a diagnosis. We mentioned right in the beginning that the risk of suicide goes up phenomenally when there is clinically significant depression, especially a major depressive disorder, but it is not limited to depression alone. We know that young, intelligent adults, especially male adults who have had a breakdown in their academic and career progress, are quite prone to suicidal attempts. So schizophrenia can be a forerunner of suicide. Bipolar disorder, less commonly than unipolar depression, where major depression tends to fall more commonly than in bipolar disorder. But bipolar disorder patients are also prone to suicide. Substance use disorders, especially if there are multiple substances being abused, the career in substance abuse has been long and led to a downward slide socially for the individual and or his family, then the risk of suicide is much greater. The more the substances, the greater the risk of suicide. Impulse control disorders go with suicidal behavior, and cluster B personality disorders, and this is where the attention-seeking part might figure a lot, particularly borderline personality disorders and histrionic personality disorders engage in this kind of behavior. This minor good news is that quite a significant fraction of them do survive. Now, please remember, suicide is not a diagnosis and it does not conform to the official nomenclature psychiatric disorders. We can also think of suicide as an impulsive act, as an act of desperation. Only transiently the person got into this state. States of desperation or despair, and these can be considered impulsive, aggressive, or sometimes disinhibited. Now, when I sit in a general hospital where I work, where I am now retired but still working, we tend to classify our cases of suicide, the attempted suicides in any good hospital actually have to be screened by the psychiatry department. We classify them as impulsive and we classify them as clinically significant psychiatric disorder. My point is that when somebody comes to you saying that he is feeling suicidal, the chances are 9.9 out of 10 that you're going to say that this person has a clinically significant disorder. But when he has made the attempt, come back to you and you review the situation, you say that it was an impulsive act. So that's an irony we got to live with. I've been battling with this riddle in my mind for at least 25 years, not found any definite solution. I wish I could really get to slideshow from here. So we have risk factors, we have warning signs, and we have protective factors. Can you all see the slide?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes, we can
So
see it.
these are
Fine,
the
it's
traffic
going
lights.
well.
The red goes with warning signs, the yellow goes with risk factors, and the green goes with protective factors. These are three things we should be looking at in some detail. Is the slide changed?
No, it hasn't changed. I think you'll have to do
Alright.
it physically.
Right, we'll go back because that flashing lights I really wanted to share. So let's move on to the risk factors for suicide. And these risk factors include demographic factors, personality factors, clinical factors, family factors, actual stressors in the person's life, and very, very importantly, access to means. So way back when I was a first year postgraduate student doing my MD, Professor Nandi of Kolkata had come up with this innovative idea that if we prevent the access to organophosphorus and agricultural poisons, maybe the risk of suicide, because he was exploring suicidal behavior in a city and in the rural areas of Bengal. And he found that if you restrict the availability of these fatal methods, then the suicide rate actually does come down. So access to means is very important. In the West, of course, the access to firearms, and there's a huge controversy we don't have the time to go into about gun laws in the US. Young people have access to firearms much more easily than anywhere else in the world, and this causes that to be a fairly common method of attempting suicide. So all these factors go into deciding how much is the risk for suicide in a particular case. In the risk factors, we were very alarmed, those of us who work with younger people, adolescents and children, that age was a very important factor. And we found that the rate of suicide among adolescents and young adults was booming. We have now discovered in the last half decade that this is not so. But again, the vitiating factor, as Anjali mentioned right at the start, is the pandemic. We don't have enough data about precisely what age groups have become more prone to suicide in this horrible period that we have been living through. We've already mentioned gender as an issue, race, religion, and culture. It is believed that certain religious dicta are so stringent about viewing suicide as a act never to be allowed, never completely frowned upon, and but the person who engages in this kind of behavior as some sort of a coward, particularly the Islamic culture. And you will find that in Islamic individuals, in Islamic societies, the rates of suicide tend to be much lower across the globe. One important factor that we did not pay enough attention to at the time when I was doing my post-graduation and maybe 10 years later, but thereafter we've got more and more sensitive to, is sexual orientation. Those who have an out of the ordinary, out of the common sexual orientation, namely normative heterosexuality, are much more prone to suicide. Not the least among them, of course, those who have a homosexual orientation, whether born male or female. Transgenders are also at a much greater risk for suicide. Then, of course, clinical diagnosis do matter. We've already mentioned depression, and particularly major depressive disorder very commonly correlates with unipolar depression. We've already mentioned drug and alcohol use, but previous attempt is the most important determinant, and this bears no, it just cannot be overemphasized. So we looked at that pie chart, Venn diagram rather, where you have all these factors. If all of them come together, just look at the overlap. When the overlap is maximum, this is the segment where you have access to means, you have personality factors of an unstable personality, not emotionally greatly unstable. We have clinical factors, we have excessive stresses in this person's life, and there are family factors. Then the risk of suicide is that much more greater if they all coincide in this particular case. Risk factors for suicide: current suicidal ideation, other mental health or disruptive disorders such as conduct disorder, in the case of adult, antisocial personality, the presence of substance abuse, impulsive or aggressive behavior, feelings of hopelessness, a history of past suicide attempts, a family history of suicidal behavior or mood disorders. As Dr. Kreitman alerted us, this is a style of communication in certain families, and the only way you got attention was by doing this. Now I want to get my attention, so I'm going to engage in this kind of behavior. A history of being exposed to family violence or abuse, because this violence makes a person abhor many aspects of life. Unfortunately, some people may emulate the violence and engage in violent behavior themselves. And sometimes, if we want to be Freudian, the violence is directed at oneself. And here we go back to the initial suicidal behavior, an act of vengeance. I do this to myself, teach myself a very bad lesson, and teach the rest of the family and society also a lesson. Access to firearms or other potentially lethal means. Social isolation, and we've been seeing this increasingly. There is an epidemic that Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General of the United States a few years ago, alerted us to, an epidemic of loneliness. We are living in an age where people do not know even their neighbors. This has been said 35 years ago, but it's very, very, perhaps more true today. And this loneliness does contribute to the risk of suicide at all age groups. The presence of divorce or separation, dowry demands, and in this country, this is a very important issue. Love affairs that have reached a point of failure. Sometimes the love affair is entirely one-sided, but with great devotion, with great obsession, one might say, not using it in the technical sense. These love affairs are contributors to suicide attempts, especially among young people. Then sometimes a marriage is fixed, and cancellation of a marriage or the inability to get married, largely in the system of arranged marriages in India, this is a factor. Illegitimate pregnancy, especially common in the West, but in India, though illegitimate pregnancies do occur, the risk of suicide has not yet been correlated. We can't dismiss it, but we don't have data to substantiate it. Then again, suicide attempt seems to be a little more common among people who have extramarital affairs, and such conflicts related to the issue of marriage do contribute to suicide and suicidal behavior. But worth remembering, the greatest risk factor is a previous attempt at suicide. Nothing marks a person at a greater risk than this particular fact. From here, we'll move on to warning signs, and somebody came up with a mnemonic, which is facts, feelings, actions, changes, threats, situations, and these are warning signs, much more important than the risk factors alone. And these are the telling signs. A morose or sad mood, increase in interpersonal problems, absenteeism, particularly but not only chronic absenteeism, increased use of alcohol or other substances, decreased work efficiency or interest, and an awareness about this in this individual, morbid preoccupation with death in his speech, in his behavior, in the kind of books he is reading, repeated utterances and behavior suggesting that one has been finding life rather meaningless. These are all indicators, or these are telling signs that this person might be at a great risk. Then we have the red flags, talk or threats of this behavior, hints such as, I won't be a problem for you much longer, don't worry. You think I've been a procrastinator, you think I don't like to do my work, don't worry, all this will get sorted out. So these are red flags that we in the mental health profession should be alert to, because they'll be, person is unlikely to come and say this to you, though they might. Usually colleagues, family members will be the ones who will receive these signals, and they would share these with you. Previous attempts can't be overemphasized. Careless, risk-taking behavior, which was not characteristic of this particular individual. Self-destructive behavior, including self-injury. Sad or angry mood that does not seem to be going away. So this person sort of festers in his temper, festers in his irritability. Another very subtle sign is suddenly giving away returning things that have been borrowed first, and then giving away one's personal possessions is something which can occur in a suicidal person. Sudden clearing out belongings and getting them in order, because I don't want to leave this place, this world in a mess. This is with a very conscientious people, and we have a substantial minority who are like that. Then the other thing which one must be alert to is becoming suddenly cheerful without reason after having been clearly down in the dumps for a noticeable period of time, and noticeable to people close to this individual. Protective factors, and the great Professor Venkoba Rao alerted us in our postgraduate days to what is called suicide counters. We used to believe that Dr. Venkoba Rao is the person who had this concept. Actually, it's and to be fair to him, he claimed no credit for this. but there are suicide counters. Many of you may have come across that lovely poem by Tennyson, which says, "Home they brought her warrior dead." There is a lady who's completely immobilized because her husband, a soldier, a knight, has died in battle, and his body is brought back, and she's totally almost catatonic. And then nothing seems to move her. She does not even cry. An elderly nurse from the house puts the child on this lady's knee, and the person breaks down and cries, and she says, "Sweet my child, I live for thee." In other words, when you have something to live for, the chances are that that becomes a protective factor against a desperate act, which is what suicide generally is. So our protective factors include personality factors, a personality with great resilience. Again, focusing on young people, but this is not important only for them, across the age group, contact with at least one caring adult in that person's life usually turns out to be a protective factor. If that person who is the contact is mature, caring, then the chances of this being a protective factor, needless to say, are greatly increased. A person who has a sense of connection or participation in some kind of organization, whether it's your service clubs like the Rotary or Lions, or it could be something like the Giants, or it could be something simple like your laughter club. A lot of young people, a lot of elderly people have been engaging in laughter clubs for the last 30 years in this country, and various organizations. It could be your community, it could be your Jat Bhais who get together periodically. Participation in such an organization gives a feeling of support, and you have a safety net which becomes a protective factor. People with positive self-esteem and a good repertoire of coping skills, people who are able to laugh at things in the appropriate sense, have a good coping strategy, and they are less likely to engage in this behavior. Access to and care for mental disorders, physical disorders, and substance. And here, our geriatric population is particularly vulnerable. When you have chronic physical illness, which is so limiting to the life of an individual, then the person may engage in suicidal behavior, especially chronic immobilizing conditions like severe arthritis, post-stroke. The risk of suicide becomes much more. When we look at preventive strategies, and this goes for all of preventive medicine, we could have universal strategies, that means apply to the whole population, educate the people about the phenomena of suicide, the fact that mental health care is available, and that would greatly reduce the risk of suicide. This is at the universal level. Selective level, we find that college students, especially in the, as I mentioned 15 years ago, this was becoming a alarmingly vulnerable segment of society. So we had to go to colleges, and this is a selective population, address college students particularly about issues related to suicide, and work on them. Indicated a person who has depression, a person who has a significant number of the risk factors that we have listed earlier. This is where we actually work with an individual or a family of that individual, where this preventive strategy is really, really indicated. Now we go on to individual or rather clinical cases now. Evaluation of suicidal risk. We must necessarily be non-judgmental when we are doing this. Evaluate suicidal ideation intent, presence of suicidal thoughts, details of any suicidal plan, seriousness of intent, the availability of social support, what are the risk factors and what are the rescue factors that we have. We mentioned protective factors, and the degree of impulsivity which characterizes this particular individual. So some of these are protective, some of these are antipathic to a person's mental stability. Evaluate that. I'm not going into particular scales of suicidal risk because that subject really baffles me, and I found it useless in my clinical practice, and I've abandoned that kind of pursuit. Assess for presence of risk factors which we have already listed. Perform a gentle, non-intrusive mental status examination in every case and collect collateral information. The person says, no problem, I'm all right, I've been attending class or attending my office very regularly. Find out from people available to collate that kind of information. And collateral information is the importance of that can never be overemphasized. So, in managing the suicidal risk, we have to stabilize medical and psychiatric conditions. We have to have a safe containment. We may need sometimes to use physical or chemical restraints. Ideally, in this situation, obtains much more in countries that have a good social work support system, especially the Scandinavian countries and the UK, where you can have supervision available to this individual if the family is incapable of doing it. Unfortunately, fortunately and unfortunately in this country, hugely, it is the family that we have to fall back on for such supervision. The ideal ratio is, of course, 1:1 patient safety monitor. Remove any dangerous objects from being available to this individual, like Dr. Nandi did in 1978. He published the paper in 1979-80. Repeated observation, don't go only on a single assessment, and consider initiation of treatment. And we have to now address the modification of this person's situation. If there is a diagnosable and treatable psychiatric disorder, please set about it in right earnest. One symptom which seems very common among people who attempt suicide, those who succeed as well as those who don't, sleep disturbance. Address insomnia, and then of course other symptoms. Address the availability of social support. Address occupational and housing concerns that many of these individuals have. Provide psychotherapy of a supportive nature, strengthening the person's innate strengths, bolstering the person's innate strengths, but not relying only on that. Also, presenting to the person other alternatives. Communicate with consultants and other providers about the treatment of this individual who seems to be at risk. How do we dispose of this particular case? In a significant number of cases, home management is quite okay, provided there's a caring family with regular outpatient follow-up, which is mandatory. And sometimes we need to admit this patient. Now, I work in a hospital where we no longer have a psychiatric ward. So we would take the recourse of taking the help of our physicians, admit to a medical unit. Wherever a psychiatric unit or a psychiatric hospital is available, there could be voluntary or involuntary hospitalization. Do not shy away from this. The law is complicated, but take recourse to taking help from medical doctors who have some expertise in the legal aspects. And please admit these patients, because in the long run, the chances are the patient, and invariably the medical community, is going to be very grateful for this. Treat agitation, anxiety, sadness immediately and aggressively. Communicate with psychiatric and other treatment providers, both inpatient and outpatient. Encourage family support and involvement. And here there's a word of caution. Family may seem to be very supportive. Internally, they are very angry, anxious, upset about this person's behavior. Please make sure that their negative emotions are adequately addressed before we rely on them to be good supporters for this person who is engaged in this rather disturbing, potentially fatal behavior. Encourage staff communication, because many a time I've noticed that staff are not adequately trained in communication skills. They should have sufficient skills, and we should have enough of training imparted to them so that they can communicate effectively to a person who has engaged in this kind of suicidal behavior. If there is any component of physical pain, please address that aggressively. This applies particularly to later middle-aged and senior citizen patients. And safety-proof patient rooms where we no longer go with the notion of padded cells, but rooms where it's safe, where there is not a window or a ledge from which the patient might take a rather drastic step. Psychopharmacology and suicide. Both, there is a positive side and a negative side to it. Decreasing the risk of suicide. Use of medications mainly to treat underlying mood disorders, particularly depression, and address acute distress not only with medication, but with suitable counseling, sometimes by our clinical psychology colleagues. And do not rely only on medication when there is depression. Also, interestingly, in the last 3 decades, we have become increasingly aware of the fact that 2 drugs that we use, lithium and clozapine, have been shown to decrease the risk of suicide. On the other hand, is there a possible risk of increasing the, is there a possibility of that we increase the suicidal risk? There is indeed. And we know that when SSRIs were introduced, within 1.5 years of fluoxetine being introduced, there were reports that young people particularly, but also older patients, were prone to getting into suicidal modes. It's worth remembering that when the tricyclics and MAOIs were the only tricyclic antidepressants available to us also, it was noticed that suicidal behavior increased in some. And this is particularly true of agitated, depressed patients where the psychomotor activity had gone down. What happens with antidepressants is that they improve the motor activity long before they improve the psychic feeling of lowness. And that seems to be the story for SSRIs in even greater measure. We do not know the exact reason why SSRIs might increase, they don't always do that, might increase the risk of suicide. Should we never give SSRIs to a suicidally depressed patient? Not true. We do not know enough. But if there is no support system available, nobody to monitor the intake of the medication properly, then be cautious. Do SSRIs increase the risk of suicide anyway? This is a controversial question with conflicting evidence even now, 30 years after we first encountered this phenomenon. While we are speaking about inpatient treatment, the role of ECTs can never be overemphasized. We have to be very, very cognizant of this. And when somebody is suicidal, no matter how brilliant an intellectual explanation he may have for how he's low, the chances of reducing suicidal thoughts in this person's mind are very, very great. Do not eschew this option, which is there before us. You might be in a setup where ECTs are not used, then you might refer them to a hospital where ECTs are being used. And this calls for good professional relationship with your colleagues in your particular place. Sorry. Also, very, very important in today's legally aware zamana, importance of documentation. Along with your clinical history, list out the risk factors, list out what you have done about the risk factors. Always take the consent of the patient for any steps that you intend to take to intervene in this particular situation, and record the progress of a particular case, whether inpatient or outpatient. There should be regular periodic updating of our patient's data and his subjective and objective, his subjective feelings and our objective observations. Challenges. There are patient behaviors that are very challenging. There are angry patients. There are patients with countertransference. There are patients with, negative transference. And sometimes we ourselves get into a mode where a patient's behavior may make us hostile to the patient, sometimes without our realizing it. If this is the case, please reach out to your senior consultant or a colleague who could handle the situation better and share with them what you have gone through. So this is a patient, this is a doctor factor. In patients, patients may develop excessive dependence. Watch out for that. Patients may be very angry with you for having rescued them or tried to rescue them. Patients may not want to confide. You have to have the social skill, the psychosocial skills to deal with all of these. Sometimes the challenge is for the family demanding that you rescue the patient at all costs. Here, we have to be humble but firm to say that we'll do our best, but everything is not entirely in our hands because there is something called the freedom of the will, and we cannot totally transgress the occurrence of this phenomenon, that everybody is free to do what they like at some level. Also, there are limitations to how effective our treatments are. While we have ECT, while we have lithium, while we have clozapine, more importantly, we have counselors with great skills. Still, as I mentioned right at the beginning, all suicides are not necessarily preventable. Sorry. So the objective of suicide prevention, especially in the young, is not just preventing the incidence of suicide. That looks good on your statistics, but more importantly, it should aim at imparting life skills that will empower them to handle life and crises as they face life's challenges. Working with young people, I am very, very aware of this. And we must be humble enough to say that we often don't have the time, and sometimes we don't have adequate skill for this. Do not hesitate to fall back on professional colleagues and use their skills to engage in the latter part of what I just talked about. And then we have societal strategies. This is the gentleman who started the Samaritans, the first helpline for people who were suicidal ideas. To emphasize the importance of this particular strategy, they are no longer called helplines, they are called suicide hotlines. And we have them across the metropolises. Most of the bigger cities in India have more than 2 hotlines available now. Unfortunately, we don't have them functioning 24/7, which is the way ideal hotlines should be operating. And hotlines are usually manned, no sexist bias over here, forgive my saying man, they could be woven, by people who have training in finding out who is at a greater risk and refer them to the appropriate agency, or give some counseling. Sometimes even common sense counseling is necessary for highly intellectual individuals with a suicide risk, and that helps a lot. There was a series of studies about 10 years after the Samaritans started in the UK, and that model was emulated across the world, to say that Samaritans were not really effective. I don't believe that research is based on very robust findings. More recently, we've had the phenomenon of gatekeepers. Who are these gatekeepers? It's a metaphor for not allowing somebody to pass through the door which leads to the fatal act. So these gatekeepers are people who are in touch with young people, especially with workers in an organization, for instance, the HR department, who are trained to pick up the risk of suicide, speak gently to these people, and gently get them to agree to take professional help. So this is a strategy that has worked wonderfully in very many instances. So in conclusion, in dealing with the suicidal person, we must be empathetic, but not too emotional. We need to be prompt, but not hurried. We need to be judicious and not judgmental. There's a thin line that separates these emotions with these conditions. Empathy and emotion go so close together. Being prompt and being hurried go so close together. Judiciousness and judgmentality go so close together. But do not ever judge the person who's engaged in this behavior. Finally, we must be patient, but our patience should not be to the extent that we have become completely slowed down, because I've seen instances where inadequate speed has led to a fatal outcome. And above all, apart from being empathetic, prompt, judicious, and patient, we must always be alert. Well, that's all I have to say for today. I thank all of you for your patient hearing. I thank Dr. Anjali for chairing this session. I thank Rashmin for giving me the opportunity to be on this forum once again. I would also like to apologize for the technical glitches that occurred. I might have benefited from sending the presentation to my hosts today earlier. Lesson learned over there. Thank you very much, and I'm open to any comments and questions from here on.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Bede. That was wonderful. I think you've covered so many aspects. And yes, we are open to questions now. Our first question is already here. Is there a specific dose of lithium and clozapine that can be termed as anti-suicidal in your experience?
One second, I'm just getting to... how do I get
if you go to the chat there.
No, I'm going to full screen.
Okay, yes. If you
so I'll start answering your question. The kind of doses that we use for mood stability in a bipolar disorder is not the kind of dose that you necessarily need to use if you're using it specifically for addressing the issue of suicide. A much smaller dose is likely to suffice. So adding 300 to 450 milligrams to an ongoing schedule of antidepressant medication works in many instances. With clozapine, it has been found that people who have psychotic symptoms and are suicidal, it is much more likely to be effective than in non-psychotic patients. The dose of clozapine needs to be adequately high. As far as my reading goes, it is not enough to have less than 100 milligrams would not be effective in reducing the risk of suicide.
Thank you. The second question here is, how do you
need to-
document? You want to increase your screen? Hello?
Yeah, just a minute.
Yeah.
No, it's, I'm trying to get full screen. I don't know why I'm not able to get it.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. I think we can see you. So how do we document progress in improvement of suicide symptomatology on paper?
By writing it down. I mean, I don't know what the problem is. You ask a person, do not ask him every day, so are you suicidal today? That's the path to hell, they say, is paved with good intention. And so we have to be very, very cautious about how we address the issue. Observe the patient's behavior, see his interaction with you and with the rest of the staff, and document whatever you observe. That he looks more chirpy today. I found him reading something he had refused to do for the last 4 days. These are the kind of observations that are very important, which a resident must take cognizance of. Also, gentle questions like, on the whole, are you feeling better today? And then you can slip in the question about no thoughts about ending your life anymore. That question is important. It's a question of the skill with which you bring it into your repertoire of progress notes.
Okay. Thank you, Doc. Lots of questions coming up. What are the biomarkers of suicide? Do you know of any, and could you share?
No, I do not know biomarkers of suicide, and I don't like to tread that path. Dr. Vyang Vaya was very famous for saying that biological psychiatry is for brilliant people. I might be bright, but I'm definitely not brilliant. And I have a reservation about biological psychiatrists that they become too reductionist. I would much, it's back. I think it's very important that we have a personal touch with the patient. There are plenty of studies which look at serotonin metabolites. I think Professor Jitendra Trivedi, the late Professor Jitendra Trivedi, had done some remarkable work on CSF findings in patients who had completed suicide. If I remember right, there was no conclusive evidence, but it seemed that the serotonergic system in these individuals was operating at a suboptimal level, was a broad finding, but it was not statistically significant, if I remember Dr. Trivedi's paper. My knowledge has not been updated since about biomarkers for suicidal behavior. My apologies for my inadequacy in this particular realm.
Thank you so much. What about the legal implications if a hospitalized patient commits suicide?
The hospital is very much culpable, and my own hospital, long ago, I had just joined my postgraduate training in NIMHANS. I had been a senior house officer, not yet a postgraduate trained psychiatrist at St. Martha's Hospital, where I now work, where a young lady who was on treatment for depression ascended to the terrace and jumped off the terrace and died. The hospital had to pay a fairly substantial compensation to the family on account of this particular instance. I remember the hospital took a rather radical stance and closed down the Department of Psychiatry because it had cost them so much. 3 years later, the department had to be reopened because the other specialists could not survive without a psychiatry department. And Dr. Kalyana Sundaram, my teacher, restarted the Department of Psychiatry over there. Suffice it to say that you are very vulnerable, but if you can substantiate that you had taken all the possible measures to safeguard against this act, then I don't think you will be culpable, though you will be dragged to court, and you with your medical officer or whoever looks after medical legal aspects of the hospital, the psychiatry department will always be summoned. I have not had to face this situation in my life personally so far, but that's where we are.
Thank you for that. And honestly, in India, we are still struggling with major hospitals not wanting to keep, psychiatric patients there just because they may kill themselves. The fact that in the ICU there are so many people dying, but when there is a psychiatric patient, everybody is. So this is, I'm sure, this is a stigma that we all have to, fight together. Lots of other questions coming up. Suicide in borderline personality patients. Suicidality versus suicide. What would you like to say on that?
The risk of suicide seems marginally more in borderline patients, especially patients who have been diagnosed late and who have not been in a psychotherapeutic setup. The recent studies seem to suggest by Dr. Bateman that those who have had individual therapy as well as group therapy have the best outcome in terms of reducing suicidal risk among borderline patients. Mindfulness-based treatments and mentalization-based treatments, these are psychotherapies, seem to reduce the overall distress in borderline patients, and they will work against suicidal behavior in these individuals, because what is emphasized over there is cognitive emotional stability, as well as indirectly self-worth. And those two promote the positive mental health of this individual and reduce the risk of suicide. Using the pharmacological agents for borderline personalities, to my mind, is not such a good idea, but I'm not aware of any hard data which looks at using pharmacotherapy for borderline persons with the risk of suicide.
Would you say that
suicidal behavior among borderline patients is tenfold more among females as compared to males? Of course, the diagnosis itself is very uncommon among males, but people have actually studied this in great detail. And Gunderson's group was the first to do this, and they found that the risk was much more among females, especially females with poor family support.
Would you say that suicidality is different in patients with Axis 1 versus Axis 2?
I would say the suicidal risk is maximal when you have Axis 1 and Axis 2.
Okay.
Those two going together maximizes the risk. I will not say that see, Axis 2 and Axis 1, if we still go by the multi-axis system of DSM diagnosis, are not mutually exclusive. So the risk of suicide is maximal among patients who have MDD, if you go by psychiatric diagnosis alone. That is compounded by the fact that when you have MDD plus substance use disorder, it goes up several fold. I don't remember the exact figures, but so forth. But I will not say that Axis 1 versus Axis 2, what is the risk factor? Because Axis 2 can very much accompany Axis 1. And when the multi-axial system came up, I was a senior resident and later a junior consultant. That time we found that people who had Axis 2 in addition to Axis 1 were at the greatest risk.
Okay, thank you. Another question which is coming up, a lot of clinicians are attending this talk. How do you handle an episode of completed suicide of a patient who's under your treatment on OPD basis when relatives inform you of the event?
Very trying situation. I think we have to make enough allowance of time and energy to deal with such patients. Sometimes the patient's family are quite angry with you to say that you did not do enough. You have to give them the space to voice that opinion and not immediately be defensive. Let them ventilate their angst if it's against you. They are going through a lot with themselves and we must make allowance for them. If they are not blaming you, and I recently had to deal with ADHD, sorry, that was not a suicidal case, but his mother turned suicidal because he drowned in a swimming accident. In cases where the patients are not angry with you, I find psychotherapeutic intervention is necessary to give them the comfort, the same as you would do with anybody close to you who has had a bereavement. You may also be in a position to humbly accept that not all suicides are preventable, and that you have later to establish that whatever was possible within your medical and paramedical confines, you have been able to do with your patient. The problem comes when we realize that we haven't done enough. And I've been a therapist to a number of doctors who have a burden of guilt on them because they feel they have not done enough. Sometimes this guilt is unwarranted because this profession sometimes gives you a feeling of omnipotence, that you can handle everything, you can cure everything. There we have to bring them a step or two down to say that, hey, you did your best. It isn't that you have all the powers in the world to save every life that has crossed your path.
True.
It is a very, very sensitive question, and I think that this is a challenging situation when the family comes and reports to you that, doctor, this has happened. I remember one of my transgender patients who was a nursing student in a smaller town in Karnataka. When he revealed to his family that he was this way, they could not tolerate it. They told him to get out of the house and fend for himself, and he ended up drowning himself in a water body in that town. And they came back and they shared this happening, and they said, we wish we had known, we wish there were other things. Well, what all those wishes are almost fruitless at that juncture.
And I think that also brings us to the point is that how much is enough? You know, now with our patients, clients having access to our personal numbers, you know, I feel a lot of doctors are also battling. I mean, am I supposed to be available 24/7 on a phone? Am I supposed to respond to every phone call or every message? You know, I remember getting a message on the 15th of August, you know, of a patient who said, oh, thank you very much. You've helped me. Now I'm killing myself. I woke up to that message. Okay. And I spent the next 5 hours, you know, trying to contact people, trying to contact the cops, you know, and I mean, nothing happened. Okay. No, there was relatives who did not answer the call. The cops did not answer the call. And finally, the patient woke up at 4 p.m. and said that, oh, you know, I'm sorry to have put you through all this because I had tried to call, you know, the patient many a times. So, you know, it becomes a little bit, but maybe that's a discussion for another time as to how much is enough and how do we protect ourselves. And coming to that, what is the responsibility of the state? Would you suggest permanent staff manning gatekeeping at helplines? They can be employed permanently at state government expense, is Dr. Naresh's comment, and can gatekeep in local language too. This model of gatekeeping helplines can be replicated in all states with different languages, but can cost effectiveness studies be done in the long run? Would you want to comment on that, Dr. Bide?
The cost will have to be, the effectiveness will have to be done in the number of lives saved. So I think that's Naresh always comes up with very creative ideas. And I think it's something definitely worth pursuing, that the state should get involved in suicide prevention. But I'll tell you, where we can't even manage vaccinations and nutrition at the state level, mental health is very low priority, and suicide will be even lower priority, unfortunately. If we have sensitized CRS, that is, what is that community, the voluntary sector stepping in to shoulder the burden of training these people, having people man these hotlines, then I think it could be a very, very good idea to have them available.
Right.
Incidentally, the IPS has started a network
yes.
of hotlines for this. Unfortunately, that is also not 24/7. All hotlines necessarily must strive to become 24/7.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And do you think our job of suicide prevention is also preventing suicides in the community? And
Very
I think
much.
we'll end with that.
Very much.
And
very
how
much.
do you think
That's
we
why
can
say
do that?
It's universal and selected and indicated. So I think we have to be sensitive to the fact that we need to increase mental health awareness in general and suicide awareness in particular, and reduce the stigma in the community. Then we can work at a community or society level to reduce the risk of suicide in every given segment of society.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this. And before I call Dr. Rashmin, I would say that I think we have used, in the last 35 years, we have tried to use art, craft, music, song, dance, romance, humor, everything to try and reduce the suicidal rate in our community. And I think the next series we should organize is that how do we use creativity to come up with more and more solutions towards suicide prevention. So over to you, Rashmin. Thank you, Dr.
Can I
Bide.
just add?
Sure, go ahead.
Inspired by what you said, people who are suicide survivors, suicide attempt survivors, are the best advocates for this. If they are willing to come out and speak about it, or given the shield of anonymity, if they can share their stories, we could publicize them. And I think that nothing speaks as well as that. Even for a cardiac patient who's had a valve replacement, who's going in for a valve replacement, I have a patient who's undergone valve replacement, nothing will work better than that. The same thing over here, much as I talk about the limitations of the medical model, here, somebody who survived and found meaning in life would do wonders to propagate this idea that suicide is preventable.
Absolutely. In fact, in the book which I authored, Death is Not the Answer, I've had a lot of suicide survivors talking about their journeys. And we recently celebrated the 80th birthday of a suicide survivor. And she laughed and she said, she announced in the restaurant, she said, 30 years back, I went to her because I wanted to die. And here I am, living and enjoying life. So I agree with you completely. And Rashmin, over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Bide, and thank you very much, Dr. Chhabria. As expected, not only was it a brilliant discussion, but it was really thought-provoking. A lot of new ideas bounced around. I think Dr. Bide deliberately engineered that glitch to kind of let us realize that there are a lot of glitches in our attempts at suicide prevention, but we shall persevere nonetheless and get our point across. And I think he did manage to get his point across quite succinctly, and as expected, he was brilliant. He managed to, in a very down-to-earth manner, convey to us all our attempts at suicide prevention. He taught us a few tricks up his sleeve, and Anjali very deftly navigated through all the questions and queries that the audience had. So it was a brilliant evening, and thank you so much, Dr. Bide, for having made the time, and thank you, Anjali, for having taken the time out as well to help moderate this really eye-opening session. And we of course thank the audience. Quite a few senior consultants have started dropping by in these sessions, so that's really heartwarming. And we hope that they are able to inspire our postgraduate students to make the most of this series. And we promise to continue to bring you such good programs in the future as well. We welcome your suggestions. The query email address is on the screen for you right now. So we'll be happy to know what kind of lectures do you want. We'll be happy to know if you have any speakers you would like to hear from back again, and we'll be happy to invite them back to teach us a few more things. And we thank all of you for having taken the time out and being with us today. And of course, thank you to Sun Pharma for having continued to be with us through this academic venture of ours. Thank you once again, all of you, and I wish you a pleasant evening ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Rashmin.
Thank you, Rashmin.
Thank you, Dr. Bide.
Pleasure to be here. Delighted to be here. Thanks.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
See you.